And welcome back to the Touchline Talk show. Again, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. It is time to talk Everton. If Arsenal weren't doing what they were doing, this might be the most interesting story in the Premier League this season, with the fact that, of course, in the Premier League era, Everton's never been relegated. The status of Everton as a club, all of the things that continue to happen. The most recent of which, Frank Lampard departing after they had this crucial 2-game stretch against two other relegation candidates, blew a lead in one game, got thoroughly outplayed in the other. And so I'm going to get into where Everton go from here next. But it needs to be acknowledged, Frank Lampard did a fine job. Not a bad job, not a great job, he did a fine job. This move also had to be made for reasons that were outside of his control. So I do want to go to bat for him a little bit. First of all, needs to be recognized the unity and belief he brought. This was a mess when he inherited it. There were some negatives that came with it, I would argue. But he got everybody, fans, players, he got everybody on the same page. He gave everybody something to believe in and got the club pulling in the same direction, which is no easy task. That has to be part of this. And the other thing is, basically, you're now trying to find somebody to do what Frank Lampard did last season. Right the ship, find a way to stay up, try and remove the toxicity. What Lampard wasn't able to do was to build on the momentum, the excitement, or maybe relief is the better word at the end of last season. Maybe part of that is because Frank Lampard is still very early in his managerial career. And a lot of that has to do with the disorganization at the top of this club, the lack of direction, the lack of money. All of this stuff that Frank Lampard had no control over. And so based on his body of work, he didn't deserve to be fired. It wasn't fair to him, and there was also no alternative because something needed to change, and he's the only thing that can change. Again, not fair to him. That's just the reality of the situation, and that is what you are signing up for if you are inheriting a club in a situation like Everton was. You are the first person to go if you choose to attach yourself to that situation and you don't find a way to remedy it. Even if most of it is not of your own doing. That's the risk that comes with joining a team in a relegation fight. But from moving forward, if I'm considering Frank Lampard for a position, this doesn't necessarily make me more confident in his managerial abilities, but it also doesn't make me less confident. I feel about the same as I did before this, maybe even a little bit better, because there was some defensive stability at times that you didn't really see at Chelsea. There was an ability to appeal to and connect with a fan base. Nobody at Everton, from a fan perspective, thought Frank Lampard was the problem. They all understood the situation. He just wasn't able to overcome everything that was thrown at him. So then that gets into the next question of who takes over, what happens next. And so I'm going to run down some of the names that are getting thrown out there. I was looking at, odds most likely to get this job. And I'm going to save what is the obvious answer for the very end. Basically, I'm just going to eliminate everybody else and then explain why, if you are Everton, there is one call you have to make first. One of the people you're hearing a lot about is Marcelo Bielsa. It should be noted first you have to convince Marcelo Bielsa to actually come to your club, and that is much more difficult than just about any other manager in the world to actually get him to want to be interested in your project, particularly when you're in a situation like Everton is right now. But let's just say Marcelo Bielsa is really interested. Marcelo Bielsa is a builder. He is a visionary. He is not a fixer. He is not a problem solver. He is not interested in short-term solutions. So to me, if you're going after Marcelo Bielsa, what you are saying is relegation is inevitable. We're looking long-term. We're not even trying to save this season. And if you're Everton, that is not an acceptable mindset to have. I don't care how bad it is. Until you are mathematically eliminated from being able to stay in the Premier League, you have got to make that priority number one. Not just because of the financial implications, but also because you're Everton and you should never be relegated. So from that standpoint, Marcelo Bielsa does not fit at all. What Marcelo Bielsa is good at, and I know he doesn't necessarily stay places extended periods of time typically, but what he's good at is what Leeds allowed him to do. Come in, make this yours, slowly turn this into what you want it to be, and we're going to back you 100%. Everton don't have that kind of time. Everton also don't have that kind of money. And I'm not just talking about being able to buy players. Because Marcelo Bielsa is actually pretty willing to work with what he's got. But Marcelo Bielsa is the guy who kind of went into Leeds before he even got the job, as he was talking to them and said, yeah, here's what I want the training ground to look like. He is going to investigate every single detail of any club he takes over. And he is going to expect that when he wants things to happen, they happen. Everton have the money to make that happen? Where is this money coming from? And not just that, but also the backroom staff he's going to bring after you just fired your manager and are dealing with financial fair play. This just makes no sense to me. And I'm a big Bielsa backer. It's not that I think Marcelo Bielsa is bad by any stretch of the imagination. I'll go to bat for him. This is about finding something that actually makes sense for Everton. He is about the last kind of manager I would want. Now, if you were to have some kind of short-term solution here and then you're already relegated and you're in the championship next season, okay, we're having a different conversation. But like I said, you cannot get to that mindset and think that way until it actually happens. And that means you got to appoint somebody who you believe is going to have a chance to turn this around. And that person is not Marcelo Bielsa. Second guy on the list, and I'm not going in any specific order, just kind of throwing out names as I wrote them down. Rolf Hasenhüttl. He would be higher up on my list, but the reality is that Southampton had been on a downward trajectory well before he actually got fired, and he was not able to put an end to that. Going back to last season, it had just kind of gotten worse and worse. Is that entirely his fault? No. He had some really good moments. I think he's a good manager. Again, this is about what Everton need right now. And you look at what Nathan Jones has been able to do in these past few weeks. Part of that is probably just having a new voice in the building and kind of a fresh start. But once those 9-0 started happening, it just kind of didn't get any better under Hasenhüttl. And there were indications that this kind of really bad season for Southampton were coming. So I see Hasenhüttl more as a long-term guy as well, that he can build something sustainable. But where he struggled was when it started going bad. And when it went bad pretty quick. And that is not what Everton need right now. Third, Wayne Rooney. Can we just remove, unless nobody else wants this job, can we just remove these people, and I'll get to the next one in a minute here, with no experience from this conversation? There is a reason by and large, the most successful managers in the world have been doing this for decades. And there is a reason that a guy like Mikel Arteta, who, by the way, a lot of Arsenal fans wanted fired on, I would argue, multiple occasions, spent multiple seasons at Manchester City under Pep Guardiola before getting the Arsenal job. You don't just get good at this immediately. It's Gerrard, Lampard, Rooney. And Rooney's done some good things. I'm optimistic about Wayne Rooney as a manager. Wayne Rooney is not prepared to go take over a sinking ship in the Premier League. Wayne Rooney, and I talked about this when he took the DC United job, did the very smart thing. Let me actually figure out how to do this when the pressure is lower. Let me learn from the mistakes I'm going to make when there's no relegation to worry about and I'm coaching DC United. And then build myself to a point where I feel ready to take on a Premier League job or a high-profile championship job like Vincent Kompany now has. Some of this is trial and error, and you just got to learn. Again, Everton don't have that kind of time. If you were in the championship, then I would consider having this conversation. But that's not where you are, and that's not how you can be thinking. So I'll go to the other person that fits into this category, and that's Duncan Ferguson. Duncan Ferguson just hasn't done this. It is way too risky right now. Again, if you are already in the championship, you're talking about, trying to get a clean start at the beginning of next season if you've been relegated. Okay, then that's a different conversation. But unless everybody else is turning you down, that's not the road that Everton should be traveling on. The other guy that inevitably gets brought up is Sam Allardyce. And this is interesting because in one sense, he is exactly what Everton need, right? Nobody is better at saving teams from getting relegated than Sam Allardyce. And that is incredibly important for a team that, again, is not going to be able to solve this by bringing in new players. Sam Allardyce raises your floor considerably. What he does not do, and why he kind of parachutes in and then leaves, is that he does not raise your ceiling, in addition to any fundamental issues you might have about the way his teams play. I'll address that with the final guy I'm going to get to in a little bit. That is a problem when you look at what has happened to Everton. Frank Lampard did what Sam Allardyce gets brought in to do last season. Find a way. And then what happened? Well, Charleston got sold out of necessity. He was not replaced. This team that almost got relegated got worse on paper, and now they're in the relegation zone. Even if you get saved one more time, you're going to be right back in the same spot again at this point next season. You've got to find a balance between being able to do this now and have hope of staying up, and also being prepared to fix the long-term problems. You can't just be continuing to look for short-term solutions. So I'm not here for Sam Allardyce either. Unless you are incredibly, incredibly confident he keeps you up, and that your options are going to be much better to attract somebody more qualified for a long-term project once you know that you're safe. If you are going to intentionally bring Sam Allardyce in on for a short term for the end of the season and are confident he can keep you up, then I will consider this option. To me, that does make more sense than Marcelo Bielsa. Not because I think Sam Allardyce is a better manager than Marcelo Bielsa, but because you have got to look at this situation. This is too important to just kind of view generically. Everton are different. They've got to think about this differently. Which leads me to what I believe is the very obvious answer here, and that is Sean Dyche. For some reason, people seem to be freaking out about the idea that basically Sean Dyche got Burnley relegated. Now, there's also the faction of people who believe if Sean Dyche had been able to see that season out, they wouldn't have been relegated. I don't necessarily buy that. I also don't care that you can consider him responsible for Burnley's relegation last season. You know who else has gotten relegated? Marco Silva, who always got a bad rap in my opinion. I didn't understand why people were so down on him. I mean, he didn't do a great job at Everton, but look at where Everton are now. Changes a little bit now that you've got some additional context, right? Do you think Fulham care that Marco Silva has dealt with relegation? Had some, some managerial situations not go very well? Look at what he's doing. And then my personal favorite, people seem to freak out when Eddie Howe got relegated with Bournemouth. I've talked about this before. I just didn't understand why anybody was questioning Newcastle's decision to hire him. It made no sense to me. And so this is where I want to go to kind of my logic with Dyche. First is, similar to Allardyce, he is going to get you defensively organized. He is going to maximize that roster immediately, and there is the potential to get significantly better quickly. That is very important because, again, you are not worried about anything other than trying to avoid relegation. Number two, and this is more from a long-term standpoint, because I'm just not convinced the season can be saved. You've got to try, and to me, Sean Dyche gives you as good a chance as anybody. The second thing, if you can find a way to either avoid relegation, bounce right back, whatever it might be, and eventually get back to being Everton, why are we, I guess I'll put it this way, are we sure Sean Dyche's Everton are going to look like Sean Dyche's Burnley? And I will never be somebody who apologizes for playing that style when you are Burnley trying to avoid relegation and trying to just stay in the Premier League and maximize your group of players with your, relative to everybody else in the league, your limited spending power. I will never apologize for doing what you have to do to try and pick up points and try and win games. I feel very differently if you're Jose Mourinho at Manchester United, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer at Manchester United, to a certain extent Antonio Conte at Tottenham refusing to play. That is different because you are in a very different situation with the squad you have. Burnley, I do not care what technique you use. Your job is to try and get points and try and avoid relegation. So I asked that question about, are we sure that Everton is going to look the same as Burnley did if they hire Dyche? Because Eddie Howe's defenses were not good at Bournemouth because it was Bournemouth. Incredibly, when he goes to Newcastle, who have the funds to go buy Sven Botman and Kieran Trippier, all of a sudden his team is, while still scoring plenty of goals, arguably the best defensive team in the Premier League. It's not that hard. He's got better players and money to go buy more. So who's to say Sean Dyche actually wants to play this way? Maybe he just looked at it and said, this is what we have to do because this is the situation Burnley is in. If you can find a way to get out of this financial mess, and we're talking, right, once the stadium is built, that kind of thing, I'm just not convinced you're going to get the same philosophy from Sean Dyche. I believe that was at least part out of necessity. So who knows what it would look like if he were to get a more talented team with more offensive firepower. Now, the other thing I will say is it's not a great, I will acknowledge it's not a great look that Vincent Kompany has Burnley playing the way that they are. But I also think Vincent Kompany is just better at this than most people. So I'll give Dyche a little bit of a pass on that. And of course, we're going to have to see, assuming Burnley get promoted, what Vincent Kompany is able to do in the Premier League because it's a different animal. Because, by the way, and this is the other point I want to make, Sean Dyche managed 2 full seasons with Burnley in the Championship. Both of them resulted in promotion to the Premier League. If you are unable to stave off relegation, if you are Everton, your next priority has to be immediately making a push to get promoted again. Because this could turn into a Leeds United, Nottingham Forest, Sunderland, and I'm just throwing out examples. Of course, there are varying situations there and varying degrees of disaster that took place. But you've got to get right back up, because if you get back up, you give yourself an opportunity. And that might be all Everton need. If you can kind of reset yourself financially, this is a massive, massive club. So again, the person best prepared to reorganize this thing on the fly and get them ready for a championship season next season is Sean Dyche. This is just not hard to me. Maybe he doesn't want it. Because if I'm Sean Dyche, my question is, which club do I feel like I have the ability to go get back to a point where I am competing for European spots? I'm not taking a job that I don't feel like I can do that at. Maybe not immediately. But if I see a way for that to happen, then I will consider it. He's too good to just take any job. If I'm him, I am more than happy to wait it out until I'm going to be picky. I'm more than happy to wait it out until I believe I have something I can make sustainable. Because nothing happening, again, in defense of Frank Lampard, nothing happening at Everton right now is appealing if you're a manager who's got to deal with all that nonsense. So I'm really curious if they're going to be able to get any of these people they're targeting. And just to throw this name out there too, there is no way in the world Thomas Frank is taking that job. Why in the world would Thomas Frank leave what is, I would argue, the single comfiest position in the Premier League right now to deal with this? And I say comfiest because he doesn't have the pressure of expecting to win every single game like Guardiola. There's frustration at Liverpool. There, at least you can find people who think they should move on from Jurgen Klopp. They're few and far between, but I do think they exist. Arteta is really safe right now because of what he's doing this season, but don't tell me that's been comfy for him. That fan base has been coming after him for multiple seasons until he started doing what he's doing this season. There's nothing comfy about Spurs. You can keep going down the list. What Thomas Frank has found is a club that doesn't expect all that much, but gives him the resources, the analytical department, right, the scouting, to overachieve and to maximize everything he's got at that club. They can finish 15th next season. They know they've got a really good thing in Thomas Frank. They know they got a really good thing going, and he knows they have a really good thing going. If I'm him, I'm only leaving for a job that I feel like I can get to the Champions League with. Everton's not that job. So I've seen that a little bit too. If they can get him, that'd be phenomenal. I don't see any way in the world that happens. So to me, the answer is Sean Dyche. I'm not worried about the relegation. Sometimes you run out of time. And so, yes, there was also some downward trajectory from Burnley like there was with Southampton. I will acknowledge that because I used that as a knock against Hasenhüttl. But to me, it's different. And I look at this very similar to the way I look at Eddie Howe. You were trying to keep Burnley in the Premier League. And you did it, and you did it, and then you did it again, and you did it again. And eventually, the goals dried up, the defense slipped a little bit. and you weren't able to survive. It happens. It's incredible to me sometimes, just in sports generally, how much we attach the ability of a coach to wins and losses. When there are so many other factors, again, in defense of Lampard, that play a much bigger role than the ability of the manager or coach or whatever, whatever sport it is. Coaches are just the ones that are easy to remove, and so sometimes they take the fall, fairly or unfairly. But Eddie Howe didn't get better. I mean, I'm sure he reflected on some things. It's not like he became an exceptionally better or different manager. He just has Newcastle's financial resources now. He's not playing with a team of guys that was built in the championship. It's a very similar situation to what Sean Dyche found himself in at Burnley. Now, they did it in opposite ways, right? Howe found a way to make Bournemouth one of the top 5, 6 attacking teams in the Premier League. They were just awful defensively, but they scored enough goals to keep themselves up. Dyche found a way to do it the other way, to not concede enough goals to avoid relegation, basically. But the question you have to always ask with coaches, and this is how I will forever evaluate them: what did you do relative to expectations and what you were working with? Sean Dyche massively overachieved. Eddie Howe massively overachieved. So it's only logical to expect, once again, if you hire Sean Dyche, you are going to overachieve. Now, what that means for Everton, I don't know. I'm not convinced that even means you avoid relegation. To me, it is that bad. That squad is that bad. But you got to give yourself a chance, and you have to be realistic about the fact that you have to swing for the fences to avoid relegation, while also making sure you're in an okay place if it doesn't work. That's a really difficult needle to thread, and Dyche threads it perfectly. He works magic in the championship. He was too good in the championship for us to actually see it all that much, because he just got himself promoted every single time. And then he stayed in the Premier League. But I have more faith in him in the championship than anybody else. I have more faith in him saving this season than anybody else. The context of the situation has to matter. The context with which you are seeing how these coaches work in their track record has to matter. Sean Dyche did an incredible lot with very little at Burnley. If I'm him, I'm not touching Everton. But that has to be the first call Everton makes. Again, it makes the most sense short term, medium term, and long term. Because he could be there for 5+ seasons if this works. You got to give him the time, and you got to realize it's not your manager. You got all these other problems you need to address. But I just look at this list of other options, and I just don't see how any of them fit. I think Dyche is the best of this bunch anyway, outside of the context. And in this particular situation, he checks every box in a way nobody else does. We'll see if Everton actually listen to me. But there is my thoughts on that situation.